Hello and welcome to the next video in the series of creating an album. Today we're looking at the Vault, which I released the other day. Now this is once again similar to the other tracks. I've introduced some synths into this one which weren't as prevalent in the other tracks. I didn't actually take that much inspiration from other tracks. Normally I might listen to a few things that have been created by other composers and then create my track, but this one I kind of just spur of the moment thing. Yeah, let's get into it. So I've got a few instruments starting off the introduction here, and a main point of this introduction is the modulation. So I'll play it off first and then I'll discuss it after. So, fairly simplistic. We've got sustained strings, we've got some wood hits that are doing these sort of tappy kind of rhythm, and we've got a ship horn, but I'll actually open it up and find out the name of it. It's not an actual ship horn, but it sounds like it. So anyway, we've got sustained strings. I'll open this up. So just like the other tracks, I've got the high strings and the low strings from Metropolis Arc 1 doing just a very standard sustained pattern. If I open it up as well, you'll see this first bit of MIDI region is modulated, and it was I was going to say a manual modulation. I clicked it in. I didn't play it in and record it. So as you can see, it's very precise, just going from 21 to 127. Then we've got the wood hits, and this is also modulated. You can see this half is 29 to 60 roughly, and the other half is 65 to 127. Now, fairly simple pattern, and then we've got this that plays every last bit of the bar, which just sounds quite cool. If I open that one up too, that was Metropolis Arc 3. With a bit of replica, you can see there, but it's just wood percussion. Couldn't say exactly what the instrument was, but yeah, just a sort of quite nice tappy sound that I hadn't used before in other tracks, and that was the main thing for me. I didn't want to keep reusing like the snares that I've used before and toms. I mean, I love the toms. The toms are in this track, but I didn't want to use the snares again. So anyway, we've got the ship horns, once again, the same modulation pattern. There we go, 45 to 127. Now this, I cannot remember what it was called. It's a Simbasi? I'm going to go with that. Not sure if that's how you say it. Just a very cool, low-sounding horn that I'd never used before, never even opened up before, so quite cool to find that. And once again, we've got the strings, the ship horns, the wood hits, no. So okay, we've got the horns and the strings going to a bus direction mixer all the way to 2, just to give it that widespread feeling. Now onto the next part, we once again roll into it from a timpani roll that I've used in other tracks. I'll play it and then I'll discuss it after. So the audio was breaking up a little bit there. That's my Mac's fault. If you listen to the track that I've actually uploaded separately, you'll probably hear that, well, you will hear that a lot better, but you get the idea of it. Got the strings, same strings from the intro, just all the way at the top of modulation, not mucking around with that, because you can't hear the difference enough when it's mixed in with everything, so therefore I'm not losing out on any dynamic changes because you wouldn't hear it anyway, and in fact it would actually just get rid of the strings and then it won't sound as good. So yeah, wood hits the same as the introduction. Then the only thing that's added in this first little part of what I would supposedly call a verse, I suppose, is staccato strings, doing a very simple pattern that I tapped in on the MIDI keyboard. Didn't care too much about velocity. You can't really hear the differences in this section. I could hear it in another section, and I'll get onto that later, but in this you can see it's all a bit random and doesn't actually affect the sound of it, and it sounds quite natural. That was once again Metropolis Arc 3. Now the main thing with this is modulation doesn't work with Metropolis Arc 3, or at least it didn't with these staccato strings, so I had to sort of improvise, and I used the gain plugin to slowly increase the volume. It was too loud normally at the minus 7.3 that I had, but it worked for later on, so I had to put the gain plugin rather than the volume automation so it didn't screw things up, basically. So very small, minus 3.4 to 0 by the end of that little section, just enough to sort of give that rising feeling. Now onto the second part. Once again we timpani roll into that second part of this verse. Now the toms come in, and it's a very simple pattern, but it's not the same as the wood hits, so it's slightly different to the wood hits. Just fairly simple pattern. It sounded a bit funny actually, to be honest, when soloed, but it works well in all of it. I haven't even put any plugins on that either. Go me. Wood hits are compressed slightly, only for volume makeup gain really. Sustained brass also comes in. Now this was just a copy of these strings. It does have a bit of modulation there, rises at the sort of pinnacle of the chord progression, and then comes back down, does the same thing. And then we get into the next part, which is a timpani roll in, as well as a flutter crescendo to help really sort of create an intense sound. So I'll play this first little bit here, and then I'll play the next bit after. What changes in this is primarily percussion, I would say, and then everything else revolves around the percussion. So I get rid of the strings, and I introduce a drum kit, which is from Metropolis Arc 1. It's a sort of just an orchestral kit. It's got that live sound, but you could also probably use a standard drum kit and maybe put a bit of reverb or openness into that sound, and then you'd get a very similar vibe. As you can see here, I've even put it onto a bus. Once again, it's fully sent to the bus and then turned down the volume. It's default Logic reverb, large and bright, and direction mixer 2. So it's kind of like having a room mic set up when doing the drums, and it once again opens it up a little bit and widens it, just like the direction mixer for the orchestral instruments, but just with, you know, this one has reverb whereas the other ones don't. So if I play that drum kit separately, simple pattern. Then what we do with that is beef it up with the other instruments. So the toms are replicating the kick, simple, and the wood hits are actually replicating the snare hit. Then we've got the brass stabs, which are Metropolis Arc 3. Use them in the other tracks. We've got the low brass and the normal horn brass, but staccato setting. And then we've also got a bass from Trillion with a slight bit of replica, just to not be as harsh, to sort of mould with the other parts of the track. So using Trillion as the bass, retro 60s, full range. I haven't mucked around with any of the settings or effects, just standard, and it sounds like this. That's going along with the brass stabs. So a sort of quite beefy section that leads into some more sort of epic sounding stuff, and then it's also where I introduced the first synth. So let's get into the next section. We use a timpani roll, the fluster crescendo, and an orchestral kit crash from Logic, like I've used in other ones, to really sort of show the impactfulness of the next part. My Mac really doesn't like me playing this track when recording, but I'll sort of show you separately what the things are doing. You could probably hear occasionally the strings were cutting out. I don't really know why it keeps doing that when recording, but anyway. So we change up the drum kit slightly, keeps the same rhythm, but we add in a couple of different cymbals. So we got this one, and that replicates the snare, and we've also got a ride, I think it's a ride cymbal, doing the kicks. So it makes it all very cymbally and crashy, and sounds quite good when mixed in. Brass stabs stay the same. We introduce the ship horn, the cymbasi, I think it was called. But not only with the cymbasi, we have a serum instrument, which is it's a preset. It was a breakdown saw, but it's just a bass, which actually has a sort of similar sound to that, as I'll call it, the ship horn, but combined together it gives it a slightly synthetic vibe, but also just once again like beefens up the sound. So I can play them together. So you can hear the difference that each one makes to each other. So I was quite happy with the sound of that, and that comes back into the last section. We've also got another serum instrument, which is another preset. That is, it doesn't really matter too much what it is. So it's another preset. It's just a plucky kind of sound. Put a lot of replica on it, and it sounds like this. So it's fairly simple, but really adds to that last little bit where it's meant to be sort of at its fullest, or at least at the moment it's meant to be at its fullest. The bass obviously carries on through. You can see the other things carrying on through. These strings I really quite like. It's a shame that my recording keeps making them stop, but you can see the line there. They are modulated for the first little bit, 27 to 127. So you get a little bit of the sound while going through that first little bit, that first little section there, and then they're truly in at the second part. The reason why the last note of that da, 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 is because that, I didn't actually notice this when I was making it, that is the sound of the low strings coming in. That was the highest note that they were going, so it was landing on a C4, and therefore that instrument as well as the high instrument were playing together, but you don't notice it really. But yeah, I really like that little riff that goes on there, and it molds well with the arpeggiated pluck. But if you listen to the actual track, you'll be able to hear it better without me constantly having it freeze and all that stupid stuff. Anyway, into the next section. I'll play it and then I'll talk about it. So it goes quite simplistic, sounds very song-like in terms of a bridge. It would go sort of quiet and down into the sort of basics of the track and then lead into the last big push of the track. So we've got piano here. Now the interesting thing with the piano is it didn't originally start off with this chord progression and melody. I think this might still be the old one, so if I solo it. So that was the original melody and chord progression for that little bit. It just sounded a bit robotic. Obviously it's just one note down, and yeah, with the other tracks not really utilising a piano in that sort of sense, it sounded odd. And so I really wanted to keep the piano because I couldn't think of anything else to sort of go in there. The strings were too powerful, even with the modulation lower and the sort of more emotional feeling of the strings being there. It didn't work with how the drums then come in and then how everything's meant to come in at the end. So I was quite happy with this new chord progression. Quite weird, but it just seems to work and it sounds a bit more natural. So that plays twice, and then the staccato strings come in halfway through that first little bit. Just one note. Now this is what I had issues with, because the sound is so clear in this little bit compared to where the staccato strings were the last time in the introduction. You can hear each different articulation and velocity, and therefore it always sounded, the way I played it in just sounded weird. So in the end I just highlighted them all and changed them all to 70 in terms of velocity, and thankfully it doesn't sound too robotic all being at the same time, because the piano just helps enough to create some difference and not sound completely robotic and computerized. When the drums come in, you struggle to hear the staccato strings when they're just by themselves, that one note. So what I did, I just copied it and put it on the next octave up, so you could hear it a little bit better. You can actually hear in this instance that I didn't change the velocity of these notes, because at that point you can't hear the difference in velocity. But when they're soloed, obviously you can, it just sounds a bit weird. But thankfully, with everything else in it, it doesn't matter. So then we've got the toms, the wood hits, and the drum kit coming in. So it's the same rhythm, we've got the same thing going on with the toms and the wood, replicating both the kick and the snare, but we've removed the hi-hat and the cymbals and crashes from the section, so it's not as loud and doesn't sound as messy for this little sort of lower section. And then we bring back the pluck into the second half of this little bit where it starts from here, but it's actually channel EQ'd. So I'm using a high cut filter going from 162 Hz to 20,000 to rise it in there. We've got a snare cymbal, which I've used in previous tracks where it replicates the snare hit, but it's just sort of a crashy, weird sound. But it works quite well with it. So into the next section, we've got a timpani rise once again, and we've got the flutter crescendo, and then with a crash, and then we're into the last final big section. I'll play it now. So, quite a lot going on. It's very similar to this section here. Oops. But we've added in a few different things, and the chords are different. The main things to hear, obviously, in this little part is the distorted synth, which sounds a little bit like an electric guitar, but just a bit more robotic. But it was a preset that I think I made, but I've saved it, and it's fairly simple goings on here. I'll play it actually solo without the guitar rig, because that's how I got the distortion. I'll go into that in a little bit, but just play it normally. Kind of a weird sci-fi kind of sound. Then with guitar rig, it's the 80s solo preset on there, which just makes everything sound ridiculously distorted, which is great for what I needed. So I actually turned off this track. You can see obviously I've got the channel EQ on sort of a little bit there, kind down to 1380. That doesn't automate, that just stays where it is. And replica. Now this might even be at mix 50. What I normally have is, so okay, so 24. So I actually bounced this down because my computer kept crashing while I was making this. So I've turned that one off, and it's just the bounced down version. For the second part, I go to the next octave up and then change it around slightly. Very cool sound going. It's a very cool sound that you don't hear very often doing that, and I thought it actually worked quite well for this track. And trying to use an orchestral instrument to just have that same effect just didn't really work. And as I was using synths already, I thought, why not? I've actually copied that across to the strings, and so it does copy the exact same pattern, and you can occasionally hear it in the background of the distorted guitar, which also gives this nice airy sound in the background. Obviously it sounds very weird soloed. That just sounds so weird, but together and with everything else as well, it sounds quite good. So we also changed the chords slightly, but it's not really a major part of it. The drum kit gets its crashes and ride back, but we don't introduce the hi-hats in the first little bit. The hi-hats come back in for this little section at the end. The arpeggiated synth comes back in as well. As well as we keep the snare cymbal that was replicating in this little section here, and we keep that going throughout the whole thing. We've got the bass back in. It's very similar to this section here. We've just included that sort of electric guitar synth, really. So that's really all I've added for this last little section, but I think it's just enough to sound quite cool and different from the previous section where it wasn't as sort of synth heavy. I dabbled with actually introducing some electronic drums, but it didn't quite fit the way I wanted, but I might try that in another track properly. So yeah, that's the creating an album part 3, essentially, for the Vault. Interesting to use synths a little more than the previous tracks. I think maybe the first track I used a few synths, but this one added a few more, and I think in a couple more tracks I might add quite a lot to maybe sound a bit Oblivion style. If you've ever seen the film with Tom Cruise, got some good tracks from M83, I believe. It always adds an interesting sound, especially combining the breakdown saw here with the ship horn, the cymbasi. It just creates this nice rich tone that neither one could have without the other. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.